The lights of the city flicker outside, each window a solitary beacon, a miniature theater of lives once intertwined in the warmth of a home. Inside, silence hangs heavy in the air. Children no longer gather around their parents in the kitchen. Siblings no longer squabble over trivialities that once bonded them in shared experience, and the hearth, once the gravitational center of familial existence, feels more like a museum relic than a living entity. We inhabit a world where the family, as it has been known for centuries, teeters on the brink of dissolution, not through violence or calamity, but through the quiet, insidious erosion of modernity itself. Consider the paradox. Modernity promises liberation, autonomy, and the unshackling of the individual from archaic constraints. And yet, in the pursuit of personal freedom, we have sacrificed the very structures that nurture identity, belonging, and emotional resilience. The traditional family, often criticized as rigid, patriarchal, and repressive, is paradoxically the crucible within which human meaning, responsibility, and character were forged. Without it, our sense of self begins to fracture, leaving us adrift in a sea of choices that, superficially liberating, are existentially disorienting. Carl Jung once observed, "The family is a microcosm of the psyche. It reflects the hidden conflicts, dreams, and traumas of its members, and through it, the individual learns the art of relating to the world." This insight is not sentimental. It is structural. The family, in its traditional form, functioned as a scaffolding for the development of conscience, empathy, and the moral imagination. It demanded engagement, sacrifice, and the negotiation of human imperfections. It was a workshop for the soul, a place where emotional intelligence was honed through daily practice and intimate observation. Modernity, with its digital distractions, individualistic ethos, and relentless consumer culture, has dismantled this workshop, replacing it with simulacra of connection, ephemeral likes, curated online personas, and the hollow comfort of material accumulation. The consequences are more than psychological. They are existential. A generation raised outside the intimacy of traditional family bonds finds itself besieged by a sense of alienation, a perpetual longing for a belonging that is no longer tangible. Children navigate a labyrinth of peer influence, media saturation, and fragmented adult guidance, often internalizing the fragmented values of a society that prizes efficiency over care. The paradox is striking. The very society that promised liberation delivers isolation, and the instruments of progress, technology, mobility, economic opportunity, become vectors of disconnection. And yet, the urgency is not solely a lament for vanished traditions. It is a recognition that the erosion of the family represents the erosion of meaning itself. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his prophetic musings on modernity, warned that the most spiritual men must also be the most isolated. He spoke not of loneliness as an accident of circumstance, but as an inevitable consequence of severing the threads of communal continuity. Modernity, in its pursuit of freedom, has made isolation structural, and the family, once the primary antidote to existential solitude, has been diminished to a symbolic gesture, its functions outsourced to institutions, media, and fleeting social networks. As the city sleeps, one cannot help but ask, in the pursuit of autonomy, have we forfeited the most vital form of human communion? In the erosion of the traditional family, we confront not merely social change but a crisis of the soul, a psychic dislocation that challenges the very foundations of identity. The question is no longer simply, how do we maintain family life? But rather, what does it mean to be human when the central crucible of our moral and emotional formation dissolves before our eyes? And as we confront this question, we begin to glimpse the deeper forces at play, forces that will become the focus of the next section. The cultural, economic, and technological mechanisms by which modernity has systematically undermined the structures of family life. Walk through any urban neighborhood today, and the signs of modernity's assault on family structures are everywhere, but subtle, almost invisible to the casual observer. Parents commute long hours to corporate offices, screens replace conversation, and children are shepherded from one organized activity to another, their days measured in schedules rather than shared experiences. The machinery of disconnection is not sudden or violent. It is systemic, woven into the very fabric of contemporary life. The family, once a cohesive unit grounded in proximity, ritual, and mutual dependency, now exists in a constant state of logistical negotiation, a fragile network held together by obligation rather than intimacy. Economic pressures play a pivotal role. Dual-income households, long commutes, and precarious employment are not merely inconveniences. They are forces that fragment attention, erode emotional bandwidth, and reduce the family home from a sanctuary to a transactional space. Viktor Frankl, reflecting on human resilience under extreme conditions, noted that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our freedom to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. In modern families, that space, the quiet moments of reflection, conversation, and mutual presence, is increasingly consumed by external demands. The freedom promised by modern economic mobility is ironically accompanied by the loss of the freedom to cultivate human bonds. Technology compounds this rupture. Smartphones, social media, and streaming services transform presence into mere co-location. Parents may be physically nearby, yet their attention is diffused across emails, notifications, and endless digital scrolls. Children, similarly, are engaged with virtual worlds that simulate connection while discouraging real-life relational complexity. Aldous Huxley's prescience in Brave New World seems eerily validated. Comfort and convenience seduce individuals into a passive acceptance of isolation, replacing authentic relationships with curated experiences and mediated gratification. Families are not destroyed overnight. They are softened, numbed, and ultimately hollowed out by a culture that prioritizes productivity and entertainment over relational depth. Cultural narratives intensify the problem. Individualism, once a philosophical ideal, now manifests as an ethical imperative. The self must be pursued, optimized, and displayed, often at the expense of communal or familial responsibilities. The nuclear family, already a simplification of extended kinship networks, is further eroded by the insistence that personal fulfillment trumps collective obligation. Jean-Paul Sartre's insistence that freedom is what you do with what's been done to you resonates tragically here. Modernity offers us the freedom to craft our identities. Yet the very social scaffolding that nurtured responsibility, empathy, and relational nuance has been dismantled. In the name of liberation, we are left to navigate an ethical vacuum where choice exists but moral grounding has been destabilized. Even cultural rituals that once reinforced familial bonds, meals, communal celebrations, storytelling, rites of passage, have been eroded or commodified. Holidays are marketed as experiences rather than moments of shared meaning. Birthdays, graduations, and family milestones are captured and performed for social media, often losing the intimate emotional resonance they once carried. Children learn the mechanics of celebration without absorbing its ethical or emotional underpinnings, and parents, caught between societal expectations and personal ambition, participate in a cycle that substitutes visibility for presence. The cumulative effect of these forces is a subtle but profound disintegration. Emotional intelligence atrophies, generational wisdom is fragmented, and children internalize a world where relationships are transactional, presence is optional, and intimacy is simulated. The machinery of modernity does not announce itself as destructive. It promises liberation, efficiency, and opportunity, but in its relentless efficiency, it quietly severs the threads of continuity that have historically anchored human life. As we examine these forces, the question arises: if economic, technological, and cultural pressures erode the family's structural integrity, what does this do to the individual psyche? How does one develop identity, resilience, and moral compass in a world where relational scaffolding is systematically undermined? This tension between structure and disintegration is the doorway into the next section, where we explore the psychological and existential consequences of a world without the traditional family. Imagine a child arriving home from school, greeted not by a warm embrace or shared laughter, but by the low hum of televisions, the soft glow of smartphones, and the distant echo of parents exhausted from their endless labors. The modern home, though comfortable and technologically advanced, often resembles a shell, its inhabitants physically present yet emotionally scattered. The consequences of growing up in such fragmented environments ripple through the psyche in ways both subtle and profound, shaping perceptions of self, relationships, and meaning itself. Carl Jung emphasized that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Yet, the very structure that once facilitated self-acceptance, the traditional family, has weakened. Within that framework, children were confronted with mirrors of their own impulses, frustrations, and vulnerabilities, allowing them to navigate conflict, develop empathy, and cultivate an internal moral compass. The modern child, isolated from these relational laboratories, must negotiate identity alone, often internalizing the emotional detritus of a world that prizes individualism over intimacy. The result is not merely loneliness, but a deep-seated existential insecurity, a sense that selfhood is precarious and belonging is conditional. This fracture manifests in multiple ways. Anxiety and depression have surged in societies where family cohesion is diminished, as if the absence of relational continuity leaves the mind adrift, unanchored to any moral or emotional mooring. Viktor Frankl, reflecting on his harrowing experiences in concentration camps, observed, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." In the modern domestic landscape, children are repeatedly placed in situations they cannot control. Parents absent, connections mediated through screens, and routines dictated by external pressures. The challenge to adapt is constant, yet without the guidance of a stabilizing relational matrix, adaptation often comes at the cost of psychological well-being. Moreover, the erosion of traditional family structures disrupts the intergenerational transmission of wisdom. Life lessons once absorbed through observation, storytelling, and shared struggle are now filtered through impersonal media, often divorced from context or ethical grounding. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. The family once provided that why, offering children a narrative of purpose, belonging, and continuity. Modernity, by contrast, inundates the individual with choices while stripping away the relational frameworks that imbue choices with meaning. The result is a generation that is empowered yet unmoored, capable yet disoriented, seeking purpose in fragments. Intimacy itself becomes a casualty. Relationships outside the family, friendships, romantic partnerships, mentorships, must bear the burden of forming identity and emotional stability that families once shouldered. The modern individual is forced into a perpetual experiment of self-definition, measuring worth in productivity, social approval, or digital affirmation, rather than in authentic connection. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential insight resonates here. Hell is other people, not in a moral sense, but in the confrontation with the necessity to define oneself in the absence of nurturing, morally coherent relational structures. The family once provided that structure, mediating the tension between individuality and community. Without it, existence becomes a series of improvisations, fragile and emotionally taxing. This psychic dislocation is not just an individual problem, it is a social one. Fragmented selves beget fragmented societies, where empathy, loyalty, and moral responsibility erode alongside intimacy. The absence of deep, enduring familial bonds reduces social cohesion to convenience, efficiency, or superficial connection, leaving a generation psychologically equipped to survive but not necessarily to flourish. Emotional resilience becomes outsourced to therapy, media, and fleeting social networks, all insufficient substitutes for the sustained, relational grounding that family once provided. As the mind struggles to compensate for the absence of familial scaffolding, one begins to perceive the full magnitude of modernity's assault, not merely on homes, but on the human soul itself. And from this psychic tension emerges a profound question. If the traditional family no longer nurtures identity, meaning, and moral compass, where, if anywhere, can the individual anchor themselves? The answer begins to unfold in the next section, where we explore how moral and ethical frameworks, once intimately tied to family life, are being reshaped and often destabilized by modernity. In the quiet of the modern household, moral instruction no longer comes from intimate, lived experience. Once, families functioned as crucibles of ethics. Children learned honesty, loyalty, and responsibility not through abstract lectures, but through daily negotiation with real people whose love was unconditional yet demanding. Now, ethical development is outsourced to schools, digital media, and pop culture, fractured, impersonal, and often inconsistent. The moral compass, once nurtured by generations of shared wisdom, drifts in a vacuum, leaving individuals to navigate right and wrong amid a cacophony of competing ideologies and fleeting social trends. Arthur Schopenhauer, ever the keen observer of human suffering, remarked that compassion is the basis of morality. But compassion is cultivated, not innate. It arises through sustained relational engagement, through the give and take, the small sacrifices, and the intimate understanding of another person's needs. When family structures collapse or weaken under the pressures of modernity, the primary laboratory for this cultivation disappears. Children grow up exposed to the suffering of others only through screens, abstract and distanced, incapable of fostering the deep empathy that comes from personal responsibility and immediate human connection. This erosion of moral formation has profound consequences. Young adults enter society equipped with knowledge but often devoid of relational ethics. They know the rules, they understand the principles, yet they struggle to internalize them in contexts that demand patience, forgiveness, and mutual sacrifice. Nietzsche's insight: the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe, acquires a new twist in modernity. The individual is not overwhelmed by the tribe, but by the absence of it, left to negotiate morality without the emotional and ethical scaffolding that traditional families once provided. Technology and consumer culture exacerbate the problem. Instant gratification replaces patience. Social media rewards performative virtue over authentic moral engagement. Ethical lessons, once transmitted through experience, become gamified, commodified, or simplified into digestible content. The consequences are subtle yet insidious. Generations adept at navigating the virtual world may be ill-equipped to manage the moral complexities of the real one. Relationships become transactional, compassion conditional, and loyalty contingent. As the scaffolding of shared experience, the family, crumbles under societal and technological pressures. Even the structure of authority within families, once a source of moral clarity, has been destabilized. The parental role, long associated with guidance, boundaries, and nurturance, is often compromised by overwork, distraction, or the ideological imperatives of modernity itself. Parents who cannot invest deeply in the moral formation of their children inadvertently contribute to a society where ethical decisions are abstract, optional, or deferred. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential challenge, "Man is condemned to be free," finds a poignant echo here. In the absence of relational guidance, freedom is no longer empowering. It is a burden, an unanchored responsibility thrust upon souls unprepared to wield it wisely. The moral vacuum created by the disintegration of family reverberates beyond the home. Social cohesion weakens as empathy, patience, and moral imagination fail to take root in the crucible of intimate relationships. Political polarization, social fragmentation, and a growing sense of cultural nihilism can all be traced, in part, to the absence of consistent, relationally grounded moral training. Modernity may promise liberty, efficiency, and choice, but it delivers them at the cost of the ethical grounding that sustains both the individual psyche and the collective soul. From this moral erosion emerges another layer of crisis: the existential void. If identity and morality were once anchored in the family, what happens when these anchors are removed? How do humans confront suffering, purpose, and mortality when the relational structures that once provided meaning are no longer reliable? These questions usher us into the next section, where we will examine the existential consequences of modernity's dismantling of traditional family life. Picture a young adult standing at a crossroads, armed with education, opportunity, and the illusion of freedom, yet feeling an inexplicable emptiness gnawing at the core of their being. The structures that once imparted a sense of purpose, rituals, responsibilities, and intergenerational bonds have weakened, leaving a psychic void where meaning once resided. The family, in its traditional form, was more than a social institution. It was a crucible for existential grounding, a context in which suffering, joy, duty, and love intertwine to create a coherent narrative of life. Modernity, in its relentless drive toward efficiency, individualism, and technological immersion, has dismantled this narrative, leaving the individual to confront existence stripped of familiar anchors. Viktor Frankl, in reflecting on life amidst unimaginable suffering, asserted, "Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning and purpose." Within the traditional family, purpose was embedded in daily life. Children understood their place, elders transmitted wisdom, and shared struggles created cohesion. Without these scaffolds, modern individuals experience the paradox of abundance and emptiness. They are free to choose, yet often incapable of choosing meaningfully. Choices multiply, yet significance diminishes. The sheer liberty to define oneself becomes an existential burden rather than a gift. The consequences of this vacuum are evident in the rise of alienation, anxiety, and depression. Humans, like all social animals, require relational and narrative continuity to form coherent identities. When families fail to provide these, individuals turn to substitutes, consumerism, digital validation, or transient social interactions, none of which can replicate the depth of connection, the weight of shared responsibility, or the moral resonance once cultivated within the family unit. Aldous Huxley's warning resonates with disturbing clarity. Societies focused on comfort and convenience cultivate beings who are technically satisfied but spiritually and psychologically adrift. Furthermore, the absence of familial anchoring alters our confrontation with mortality and suffering. Traditionally, family bonds framed human life within a network of care, responsibility, and narrative continuity. Birth, growth, struggle, and death were experienced collectively, embedding each individual's existence within a web of meaning. Now, the inevitability of loss, failure, and death is often faced in isolation, heightening existential terror. Without a relational framework to mediate life's trials, the human spirit risks succumbing to nihilism, a sense that efforts, joys, and relationships are ultimately insignificant. Nietzsche's observation, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how," underscores the critical role of purpose. The traditional family provided that why, offering belonging, duty, and ethical continuity. Its erosion leaves individuals adrift, searching for meaning in fragmented experiences and ephemeral engagements. Modernity's promise of liberation and self-definition turns cruel in practice. Freedom without grounding becomes disorientation, choice without context becomes paralysis, and autonomy without relational roots becomes existential vulnerability. Yet within this void, a subtle challenge emerges. The absence of the family as a moral and existential anchor forces the individual to confront questions of selfhood, purpose, and ethical responsibility with stark immediacy. Whereas prior generations could rely on inherited structures for guidance, the modern individual must cultivate meaning actively, drawing from philosophy, creative endeavor, and conscious relational investment. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential insistence, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself," highlights both the peril and the potential of this predicament. Modernity strips the scaffolding, but in doing so, it also demands a conscious engagement with existence itself. The existential consequences of family dissolution are thus profound. A generation free in form yet constrained by psychic dislocation, liberated materially but burdened spiritually. And from this contemplation arises the final, crucial question. If modernity has systematically eroded the structures that anchor identity, morality, and meaning, what paths remain for reconstructing human connection, purpose, and hope? Section 6 will address this imperative, exploring the possibility of reclaiming depth and continuity in a world shaped by fragmentation. In the silence of a modern home, there exists both a warning and a possibility. The erosion of traditional families has left a generation navigating identity, morality, and meaning without the relational scaffolding that once made life coherent. Yet in recognizing the depth of this fracture lies the potential for conscious reconstruction, a deliberate effort to reclaim intimacy, ethical grounding, and existential purpose, even amidst the relentless tide of modernity. Humanity, after all, has always survived not merely through structures, but through the conscious cultivation of connection and reflection. The first step is awareness. Carl Jung observed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Many of the crises facing modern families are insidious, mediated by habits, cultural norms, and technological immersion that operate beneath conscious reflection. Recognizing the forces that fragment attention, distort priorities, and substitute presence with performance is crucial. Only by naming these dynamics can individuals begin to reclaim intentionality in their relationships, prioritizing time, emotional engagement, and shared responsibility over mere collocation or digital interaction. Next is the cultivation of depth within relationships. While traditional families provided this by default, the modern individual must actively construct it. Rituals, whether as simple as shared meals, storytelling, or collective creative projects, anchor relational bonds and provide a framework for transmitting values, empathy, and resilience. Viktor Frankl emphasized that love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. Intentional relational investment fosters not only emotional intimacy but also the ethical and existential scaffolding that modern life often neglects. This is where the individual can transform absence into presence, fragmentation into cohesion. Simultaneously, moral and existential education must be approached consciously. The erosion of intergenerational wisdom necessitates proactive cultivation of ethics, resilience, and philosophical reflection. Reading, dialogue, mentorship, and community engagement can supplement the loss of traditional moral instruction. Nietzsche's insight, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow," remains instructive. Meaning must be actively sought and embedded, rather than assumed. In doing so, individuals and families can create a microcosm of continuity, transmitting values and purpose across generational lines, even when societal scaffolding is absent. Technology, often implicated in fragmentation, can also be harnessed as a tool rather than a distraction. Mindful use of communication platforms, digital storytelling, and shared online projects can enhance connectivity rather than replace it. The distinction lies in intentionality. Tools that mediate presence become extensions of relational practice rather than substitutes for it. This conscious engagement transforms the very medium that once threatened familial cohesion into a vehicle for reconstruction. Finally, the pursuit of community beyond the nuclear family, extended kinship, friendship networks, and voluntary social bonds, can compensate for the structural weakening of traditional families. Humans are fundamentally relational beings. When immediate familial bonds falter, consciously curated networks can provide ethical, emotional, and existential anchoring. Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of freedom, "Man is condemned to be free," here becomes empowering. Liberation is not a threat, but a responsibility to consciously shape relational and moral life. In conclusion, modernity's assault on traditional families is profound, reshaping the psyche, moral frameworks, and existential foundations. Yet within this crisis lies the possibility for deliberate reconstruction. Awareness, intentional relationships, ethical cultivation, mindful technology use, and extended community engagement offer paths toward reclaiming continuity and meaning. The task is neither easy nor automatic. It demands vigilance, reflection, and courage. But in undertaking it, humanity can transform the fracture imposed by modernity into an opportunity for conscious, profound, and enduring connection. A family not merely defined by structure, but by presence, love, and shared purpose.